At the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, far from the industrial cities that powered America's late 19th century economy, stands Biltmore Estate, a structure so large that it immediately resists familiar categories. It is often called a mansion, sometimes a castle, and occasionally a folly, yet none of those labels capture the economic logic that brought it into existence. Biltmore was not simply a home designed to impress guests or a monument to private taste. It was conceived at a moment when wealth in the United States had reached a scale that demanded new forms of storage, management, and projection. The building was only the most visible expression of a much larger system, one rooted in land, capital, and long-term financial assumptions that, at the time, appeared not only reasonable but prudent. To understand why a private individual could rationally commission a residence containing more than 200 rooms and surrounded by thousands of acres, it is necessary to step back into an era when American capitalism was still young, unevenly regulated, and extraordinarily generous to those who controlled its key arteries. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States experienced a sustained expansion unlike anything seen before. Railroads stitched together regional markets, industrial output multiplied, and financial institutions evolved rapidly to channel profits into new ventures. Wealth did not merely grow, it compounded, often at rates that outpaced the ability of traditional assets to contain it. For the families at the apex of this system, money was no longer just income or savings. It became an organizing force that shaped landscapes, labor patterns, and entire regional economies. Biltmore emerged from this context as a physical answer to an abstract problem. What does one do with wealth that is too large to be liquid, too permanent to be speculative, and too visible to remain purely financial? By the 1880s and 1890s, the idea of holding capital solely in cash or securities carried risks that were increasingly apparent. Financial panics were frequent, markets were volatile, and legal frameworks offered limited protection against sudden shifts in confidence. Land, by contrast, promised stability. It could absorb capital in vast quantities, generate ongoing returns, and serve as collateral against future borrowing. When combined with agricultural production, forestry, and controlled tenancy, land could be transformed from a static holding into an active economic engine. The decision to build at such a scale therefore reflected a broader logic of asset consolidation. Extreme wealth, when left dispersed, becomes vulnerable to political scrutiny, taxation, and market fluctuation. When concentrated into a single integrated estate, it gains a different character. It becomes legible as a productive unit rather than a hoard, and defensible as an enterprise rather than indulgence. In this sense, Biltmore was less a retreat from capitalism than an extension of it, translated into stone, timber, and acreage. Its size was not accidental excess, but a deliberate attempt to match physical scale with financial reality. At the time of its construction, the United States had no federal income tax, labor protections were minimal, and land in the Appalachian region was relatively inexpensive compared to coastal or urban centers. These conditions created a window in which massive private projects could be undertaken with limited interference and predictable costs. Labor could be hired seasonally, materials sourced in bulk, and entire communities organized around the needs of a single employer. The estate thus functioned as a localized economy, one in which wages, rents, and production were coordinated under a unified vision. From the outside, this appeared as grandeur. From the inside, it resembled a carefully managed balance sheet. The promise of extreme wealth during this period lay in its apparent permanence. Industrial fortunes, especially those tied to transportation, energy, and finance, seemed insulated from decline. Demand for rail transport, raw materials, and manufactured goods was expanding alongside population growth and territorial integration. Returns were reinvested continuously, reinforcing the dominance of those already positioned at the top. In such an environment, It was reasonable to assume that income streams would persist across generations, supporting not only lifestyles but institutions. A mansion like Biltmore was built with the expectation that it would never need to justify itself anew. Its existence was premised on continuity. This expectation shaped every aspect of the estate's conception. The house itself was designed not merely to house a family, but to anchor a network of activities that extended outward into the surrounding land. Farms, forests, workshops, and service buildings were integrated into a single plan intended to reduce dependence on external suppliers and stabilize operating costs. By internalizing as many functions as possible, the estate aimed to behave like a vertically integrated firm rather than a passive residence. Even leisure spaces were part of this logic, reinforcing social capital and signaling stability to peers, partners, and institutions that mattered in elite financial circles. Importantly, the cultural climate of the Gilded Age did not yet view such concentrations of wealth as inherently problematic. While inequality was visible, it was often framed as evidence of progress rather than imbalance. Large estates were celebrated as symbols of national success, proof that American capitalism could rival and even surpass the aristocratic traditions of Europe. In this narrative, building big was not an act of defiance, but of participation, an alignment with a global elite that measured power in landholdings and architectural presence. The mansion became a credential, a way of translating abstract financial dominance into something tangible and enduring. Yet beneath this, confidence lay assumptions that would later prove fragile. The belief that land values would rise indefinitely, that labor would remain cheap and compliant, and that political attitudes toward wealth would remain favorable was shared widely among the economic elite. These assumptions made the initial investment appear conservative rather than reckless. When costs were calculated against expected returns from agriculture, forestry, and ancillary enterprises, the numbers seemed to justify the scale. The estate promised not only shelter but yield, not only prestige but protection against the uncertainties of modern finance. In this sense, Biltmore was built at the intersection of optimism and control. It represented a moment when private individuals believed they could design systems large enough to outlast market cycles and flexible enough to adapt to change. The mansion was the visible core of that system, but the true ambition lay in the surrounding land and the social order it supported. To those involved in its creation, this was not extravagance, but strategy, a way of anchoring wealth in something that could be managed, inherited, and defended over time. Understanding this promise is essential before examining how the money was actually made, because it explains why the initial decision to build appeared rational within its historical context. The estate was not a gamble, but a calculated response to the opportunities and risks of its era. It was an attempt to turn transient industrial profits into a durable economic structure, one that could sustain itself long after the original sources of wealth had faded from view. If you want to understand how wealth begins to build structures like this, let me know and I'll continue. The wealth that made Biltmore Estate possible did not originate in land, architecture, or agriculture. It originated in financial systems that were already operating at a scale far removed from the physical world the estate would later occupy. By the time construction began, the capital behind the project had been accumulating for decades inside one of the most powerful economic machines of the 19th century, the American railroad finance complex. This was not wealth created by a single breakthrough or entrepreneurial risk, but by sustained control over infrastructure, capital flows, and financial leverage at a national level. At the center of this system stood George Vanderbilt, whose personal fortune was inseparable from a broader family network that dominated transportation and finance. The railroads were not merely companies that moved goods and passengers. They were platforms that structured the entire economy. Every mile of track determined which towns prospered, which industries gained access to markets, and which regions attracted investment. Owning railroads meant owning the channels through which economic life flowed, and this ownership translated into pricing power, political influence, and reliable cash generation. Railroad wealth functioned differently from later industrial fortunes built on consumer brands or mass production. Its strength lay in predictability. Freight volumes fluctuated, but demand for transportation was constant and growing. Once the network was built, marginal costs declined while revenues scaled with national expansion. Railroads issued bonds aggressively, using future earnings to finance present growth, and financial houses tied to these networks earned fees, interest, and equity positions that compounded over time. This structure rewarded patience and scale rather than innovation alone, creating fortunes that expanded steadily across generations. Crucially, much of this wealth was not held as cash. It existed as ownership stakes, bonds, and trust-managed assets that produced income without requiring direct involvement. Dividends arrived regularly. Interest payments were contractual, and the underlying assets were considered too essential to fail outright. This created a financial environment in which personal spending decisions were insulated from short-term market shocks. Even during downturns, the core income streams remained intact enough to support large, long-horizon projects. By the late 19th century, the family's capital base had reached a point where traditional investment outlets were no longer sufficient. Additional railroad expansion offered diminishing returns. Urban real estate markets were increasingly crowded, and financial instruments exposed holders to periodic panics that could temporarily freeze liquidity. Against this backdrop, deploying capital into a massive landed estate was not an eccentric choice, but a strategic diversification. It shifted a portion of wealth out of abstract financial space and into tangible assets that could operate under different economic rules. The money that flowed into Biltmore, therefore, came from surplus rather than necessity. Construction costs, while enormous by ordinary standards, represented a manageable allocation relative to annual income and total net worth. More importantly, these expenditures were spread over time, smoothing cash outflows and aligning them with predictable inflows from trusts and investments. This temporal alignment mattered. It allowed the project to proceed without debt pressure or the need for rapid monetization, preserving control and flexibility. The logic extended beyond the house itself. Land acquisition in Western North Carolina was financed with the expectation that acreage would serve multiple roles simultaneously. It would absorb capital, appreciate over time, and generate operating income through forestry. In agriculture, timber rights alone offered long-term revenue potential, especially as industrial demand for lumber increased nationwide. Unlike speculative ventures, forests could be harvested selectively, balancing income with regeneration and maintaining the asset base indefinitely in theory. Labor costs further reinforced the feasibility of the model. The region's economy was largely rural, with limited alternative employment opportunities. Wages were low by national standards, and the estate scale allowed it to act as a dominant employer, setting terms rather than responding to them. This reduced operating volatility and ensured that much of the value generated on the land remained within the system. In effect, the estate internalized both production and consumption, paying wages that circulated back through rents, services, and local trade. Another often overlooked source of financial strength was social capital. Association with established financial dynasties lowered borrowing costs, facilitated favorable contracts, and discouraged regulatory scrutiny. Even when the estate did not seek external financing, its existence reinforced perceptions of stability and permanence that benefited the broader portfolio. In elite financial circles, visible assets mattered. They signaled that wealth was anchored, disciplined, and managed for the long term rather than exposed to speculative excess. It is important to note that this wealth was not dependent on the estate succeeding as a profit center in the narrow sense. Biltmore did not need to outperform financial markets to justify its existence. It needed only to preserve value, generate partial returns, and convert volatile income into stable assets. The underlying railroad and financial revenues continued to cover any shortfalls, allowing the estate to operate without immediate pressure to optimize efficiency. This safety net is what made the scale possible. Without it, the project would have been untenable from the start. The revenue logic behind the mansion was therefore indirect. The house itself consumed capital, but the system around it was designed to recycle and protect that capital over time. Wealth flowed from national infrastructure into local land, from abstract instruments into physical systems. In doing so, it created the illusion that the estate was self-contained, when in reality it was sustained by a much larger financial ecosystem that extended far beyond its boundaries. Understanding how the money was made reveals why the project appeared sustainable at inception. The sources of wealth were diversified, resilient, and politically entrenched. They produced income streams that seemed immune to disruption and large enough to support ambitious experiments in land-based capitalism. Only later would it become clear that the stability of these sources was contingent on broader economic and social conditions that were already beginning to change. If you want to see how this money was then engineered into a functioning system on the ground, let me know, and I'll continue. Once the capital had been secured in the land assembled, Biltmore Estate entered its most revealing phase, the moment when a private residence began to behave like an economic organism. This transition did not happen accidentally, nor was it a decorative afterthought layered onto an already completed mansion. From its earliest planning stages, the estate was conceived as a coordinated system in which architecture, land use, labor, and prestige worked together to stabilize wealth and extend its lifespan. The mansion stood at the center, but it was never meant to function alone. It was the administrative and symbolic core of a much larger enterprise. The first and most fundamental element of this system was land integration. Thousands of acres surrounding the house were not treated as ornamental grounds, but as productive assets. Fields were designated for agriculture, forests were mapped for managed timber extraction, and water resources were controlled to support both farming and domestic use. By centralizing ownership and planning, the estate could smooth seasonal variability and reduce exposure to external suppliers. Food, fuel, and materials were increasingly sourced internally, converting what would otherwise be operating expenses into internal transfers within the same balance sheet. Agriculture played a dual role in this model. On one level, it provided direct output in the form of dairy, meat, produce, and grains, much of which supplied the household and its staff. On another level, it functioned as a demonstration of modern efficiency. By adopting scientific farming techniques and investing in equipment and breeding programs, the estate positioned itself as a regional benchmark. This mattered economically because it attracted skilled managers, justified higher quality labor, and reinforced the perception that the estate was progressive rather than wasteful. Reputation, in this context, was not abstract. It translated into operational advantages. Forestry was even more central to the estate's financial logic. Timber represented a long-duration asset that could be harvested selectively, producing revenue while preserving the underlying capital. Unlike annual crops, forests allowed managers to align extraction with market conditions, holding inventory standing until prices were favorable. This flexibility made timber an ideal complement to the more rigid income streams flowing from financial investments elsewhere. Over time, forestry income helped offset maintenance costs and provided a hedge against fluctuations in agricultural output. Labor organization further reveals how the estate functioned as a system rather than a household. Hundreds of workers were employed across farming, forestry, maintenance, and domestic service, many of them living on or near the property. Housing, utilities, and services were often tied to employment, creating a semi-closed labor market. This arrangement reduced turnover, and stabilized wages while ensuring a reliable workforce attuned to the estate's rhythms. From a financial perspective, it also allowed the estate to internalize social costs that might otherwise appear as external expenses, keeping cash flows predictable. The mansion itself served as a tool of coordination and control. Administrative offices, storage areas, and service corridors were designed to facilitate large-scale operations discreetly. The physical separation between public grandeur and private logistics mirrored the financial separation between visible consumption and underlying production. Guests saw abundance and ease, while behind-the-scenes systems ensured that resources were tracked, replenished, and allocated efficiently. This architectural logic reinforced managerial discipline, turning space into a form of governance. Prestige economics played a subtler but equally important role, hosting events, accommodating influential visitors, and maintaining an image of stability enhanced the estate's standing within elite networks. This social capital did not produce line-item revenue, but it lowered risk elsewhere. Access to favorable contracts, political goodwill, and informal protections depended in part on visibility and perceived permanence. The mansion thus acted as collateral in a reputational sense, anchoring trust in the broader financial activities connected to its owners. Another layer of the system was vertical integration. Workshops, repair facilities, and specialized staff reduced dependence on external markets for maintenance and upgrades. While this required higher upfront investment, it lowered long-term costs and insulated the estate from price volatility. Over time, such integration also generated institutional knowledge, allowing managers to optimize operations based on local conditions rather than generic market assumptions. The estate became not just a consumer of goods and services, but a producer of solutions tailored to its own scale. Crucially, the estate's financial system was designed with time horizons measured in decades rather than quarters. Decisions about planting, construction, and staffing were evaluated based on long-term sustainability rather than immediate return. This approach mirrored the logic of the family's broader investments, which emphasized durability and control over rapid growth. In this sense, Biltmore functioned as a physical analog to a diversified portfolio, balancing risk across different asset types and operational domains. Yet, even at its most efficient, the system depended on continuous alignment between internal operations and external conditions. Agricultural yields assumed stable markets, forestry assumed steady demand, and labor arrangements assumed a compliant workforce. Prestige assumed social acceptance of concentrated wealth. As long as these assumptions held, the estate could operate smoothly, converting scale into stability. The mansion's grandeur was not merely decorative. It was a signal that the system was working as intended. This phase represents the height of the estate's economic coherence when money, land, and labor moved in relative harmony. It was a moment when private wealth could plausibly organize itself into a self-reinforcing structure, buffered from shocks and insulated from scrutiny. Understanding this system is essential before examining the pressures that would slowly erode it, because the same mechanisms that once provided resilience would later amplify vulnerability. If you want to see where the hidden costs began to surface inside this system, let me know and I'll continue. At its peak of operational coherence, Biltmore Estate appeared to embody a near-perfect alignment between wealth, land, and long-term planning. From a distance, the system looked self-sustaining, even elegant in its internal logic. Yet beneath this surface harmony existed a dense accumulation of costs that were not immediately visible in annual accounts or public narratives. These costs did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. They accumulated quietly, year after year, embedded in the very scale that once made the estate seem invulnerable. The most persistent of these costs was maintenance, not as a single category, but as a constant, multidimensional obligation. A structure of such size could never be fully finished in any meaningful sense. Stonework weathered, Roofs demanded inspection, mechanical systems aged, and interiors required continuous care simply to prevent decline. Unlike smaller properties, where deferred maintenance might go unnoticed for years, any lapse at this scale risked cascading damage. Water intrusion in one wing could compromise multiple floors. A failure in heating infrastructure could affect hundreds of rooms. Simultaneously, the mansion did not allow neglect to remain localized. Labor intensified this burden. While the estate's workforce had once represented stability, it gradually became a fixed cost that resisted reduction. Skilled workers familiar with the property's unique systems were difficult to replace, and their institutional knowledge could not be easily transferred. As a result, staffing levels remained high even when certain operations became less productive. Wages, housing, and provisions continued regardless of fluctuations in output, turning what had once been a flexible input into a rigid expense. Energy consumption further complicated the picture. Heating, lighting, and water systems designed for 19th century expectations became increasingly inefficient as standards evolved. Retrofitting such systems was expensive and disruptive, yet failing to do so raised operating costs steadily. The mansion's very design, optimized for grandeur rather than efficiency, locked the estate into patterns of consumption that could not be easily altered without undermining its structural integrity. Each improvement required custom solutions, multiplying costs relative to modern, standardized alternatives. The surrounding land, too, generated hidden liabilities. Agricultural operations demanded ongoing investment in equipment, livestock, and soil management. Forestry required careful oversight to balance extraction with regeneration, a process that tied up capital for long periods before yielding returns. Roads, fences, and outbuildings expanded the maintenance footprint far beyond the mansion itself. Every acre under management represented both potential income and unavoidable expense, and the balance between the two grew more delicate as external conditions shifted. Administrative complexity added another layer of cost. Managing such a diversified operation required coordination across departments that did not always align in their incentives or timelines. Decisions that optimized one area could increase costs elsewhere. For example, maximizing agricultural output might strain labor resources needed for maintenance, while conserving forests could reduce short-term revenue needed to cover household expenses. The estate's integrated nature, once a strength, made it harder to isolate and correct inefficiencies. Perhaps most importantly, opportunity cost began to assert itself. Capital tied up in land, buildings, and internal operations could not be easily redeployed as new investment. Opportunities emerged as financial markets evolved, offering higher returns with greater liquidity. The estate's assets became comparatively inert. While they preserved value, they did not compound at the same pace as newer forms of capital. This divergence was subtle at first, but over decades it eroded the relative advantage that had justified the estate's scale. Social expectations also imposed costs that were rarely quantified. Maintaining prestige required continuous spending on hospitality, presentation, and conformity to elite norms. These expenditures did not generate direct returns, yet reducing them risked diminishing the estate's reputational value. The mansion thus operated under an implicit mandate to appear effortless, even as the resources required to sustain that appearance grew heavier each year. Taken together, these hidden costs did not immediately threaten the estate's survival. They were absorbed by the broader financial ecosystem that had originally funded its creation. However, they altered the system's sensitivity to external change. What had once been a robust structure with ample margins became increasingly dependent on stable income streams and favorable conditions. Scale, which had provided insulation, now amplified every inefficiency and constrained every adjustment. This slow accumulation of friction is what transformed the mansion from a demonstration of economic mastery into a test of endurance. The estate could still function, but it required ever greater effort simply to remain unchanged. Understanding these costs is essential to grasping why later economic shifts proved so destabilizing, because they reveal how little room for adaptation remained by the time pressure arrived. If you want to see where these pressures finally exceeded the system's capacity to absorb them, let me know and I'll continue. By the early 20th century, the economic environment that had made Biltmore Estate appear rational and sustainable was undergoing a series of structural changes that no single estate, regardless of scale or planning, could fully absorb. These changes did not arrive as a single crisis. They accumulated through policy shifts, labor transformations, and market realignments that slowly but decisively altered the cost-benefit equation underlying large, privately operated estates. The breaking point was not dramatic collapse, but the quiet realization that the system no longer balanced. One of the most consequential shifts was fiscal. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 fundamentally changed the relationship between private wealth and the state. For fortunes that had previously operated largely beyond systematic taxation, recurring claims on income altered long-term planning assumptions. Cash flows that once moved freely into maintenance, expansion, or reinvestment were now partially redirected. Over time, progressive rates and additional levies, including estate and inheritance taxes, compounded this effect. Wealth that had been structured to endure across generations now faced erosion at each transfer point, forcing owners to reconsider the viability of holding capital in illiquid, high-cost forms. Labor markets also transformed in ways that directly challenged the estate model. Industrialization and urbanization expanded employment options, reducing the supply of low-cost, stable rural labor. At the same time, labor regulations began to formalize working conditions, wages, and hours. What had once been flexible arrangements, rooted in paternalism and local dominance, became subject to external standards. Compliance increased costs and reduced managerial discretion, undermining one of the estate's original advantages: its ability to internalize labor on favorable terms. Market dynamics further strained the system. Agricultural prices became more volatile as national and international markets integrated, making farm operations less predictable. Timber markets experienced cycles that did not always align with the estate's cash needs, limiting the effectiveness of forestry as a stabilizing income source. Meanwhile, financial markets offered alternative investment vehicles that promised higher returns with far greater liquidity. In comparison, the estate's assets appeared increasingly inefficient, tying up capital in forms that were costly to maintain and slow to adjust. Social attitudes toward concentrated wealth shifted as well. Public scrutiny intensified, and large estates came to be viewed less as symbols of progress and more as relics of inequality. This shift did not directly impose costs, but it altered the political environment in which policy decisions were made. Support for taxation, regulation, and redistribution gained momentum, increasing the likelihood that future changes would further disadvantage large, privately held properties. Prestige, once a buffer, lost much of its protective function. The cumulative effect of these pressures was to compress margins. Operating costs rose steadily, while the relative contribution of the estate to overall wealth declined. What had once been justified as a strategic anchor for capital now demanded continuous subsidy from external income sources that themselves were under pressure. The estate no longer amplified wealth, it consumed it. This inversion marked the true breaking point, even though the physical structure remained intact and operations continued. Importantly, this transition did not imply mismanagement or failure of vision. The original model had been built for a different economic order, one characterized by minimal taxation, abundant labor, and limited alternatives for capital deployment. As that order dissolved, the estate's internal logic lost coherence. Adjustments were possible at the margins, but the fundamental mismatch between scale, and environment could not be resolved without abandoning the very features that defined a mansion. By the time these realities became undeniable, choices narrowed. Downsizing threatened the integrity of a system, while maintaining scale required ever greater infusions of external capital. The estate stood at a crossroads, not because it had failed in its own terms, but because the world it was designed for no longer existed. If you want to understand how this pressure translated into a shift from power to liability, let me know, and I'll continue. By the time the structural pressures described earlier had fully converged, Biltmore Estate entered a phase that is often misunderstood as decline, but is more accurately described as inversion. The very attributes that once signaled power, permanence, and control began to function as constraints. Scale no longer amplified wealth. It absorbed it. Complexity no longer stabilized operations. It slowed decision-making. What had been an integrated economic system gradually transformed into a liability that required justification rather than celebration. The first visible sign of this inversion was the tightening of cash flow. While the estate still generated income through agriculture, forestry, and associated operations, these revenues were no longer sufficient to cover the full spectrum of expenses without external support. Maintenance costs did not merely persist. They escalated as aging infrastructure demanded specialized care. Deferred maintenance, once a manageable tactic, became risky at scale, threatening irreversible damage to core structures. The estate thus entered a cycle in which spending was required simply to prevent loss, not to create value. Labor adjustments followed, but cautiously and often reluctantly. Reducing staff risked operational failure, as fewer workers meant slower response times and greater wear on systems designed for constant attention. Yet maintaining historical staffing levels strained finances further. This tension produced incremental reductions rather than decisive restructuring, preserving short-term functionality at the cost of long-term efficiency. In financial terms, fixed costs remained stubbornly high, limiting the estate's ability to adapt to declining relative income. Another critical shift occurred in how the estate related to the outside world. What had once been a largely self-contained system began to open outward, not by choice but by necessity. Portions of land were sold or repurposed, reducing the asset base but providing liquidity. This process altered the estate's internal balance, as supporting operations lost scale and coordination. Each divestment eased immediate pressure, while weakening the integrated logic that had originally justified the estate's existence. Perhaps the most consequential change was conceptual rather than operational. The estate ceased to be treated primarily as a private economic engine and began to be understood as a cultural and historical asset. This reframing was pragmatic. By repositioning the mansion as something to be shared, rather than solely maintained, its costs could be partially externalized. Opening the house and grounds to visitors transformed prestige into revenue, converting social interest into cash flow. However, this also marked the end of the original model. The estate was no longer sustaining wealth. It was sustaining itself through exposure. This transition carried its own costs. Public access required staffing, marketing, and compliance with emerging safety and preservation standards, where from visitors accelerated maintenance needs and revenue fluctuated with broader economic conditions. Yet despite these challenges, the new model offered something the old one no longer could: a path to survival that did not depend entirely on private capital. The mansions, meaning, shifted from asset to institution, from balance sheet anchor to managed heritage. The psychological dimension of this shift should not be underestimated. For an estate designed to embody continuity and control, accepting institutionalization represented a fundamental concession. Decision-making authority diffused, priorities realigned, and the estate's future became linked to public interest rather than private strategy. Power, once expressed through exclusivity and scale, was replaced by stewardship and compromise. The mansion remained impressive, but its role in the economic life of its owners was permanently altered. What emerged from this phase was not collapse, but transformation under constraint. The estate survived precisely because it relinquished the conditions that had originally defined its power. In doing so, it revealed a broader truth about large-scale private wealth structures. When external conditions change faster than internal systems can adapt, preservation requires reinvention. The cost of maintaining control can exceed the value of control itself. This moment, when power becomes liability, is the hinge on which the entire story turns. It explains why such estates rarely return to their original function once pressures mount. Survival comes at the price of redefinition, and continuity is achieved only by abandoning the economic logic that made the structure possible in the first place. If you want to explore why this model cannot realistically return in the modern economy, let me know and I'll continue. Looking back from the vantage point of the modern economy, it becomes clear that the economic logic which once sustained Biltmore Estate was not merely disrupted by temporary forces. It was rendered obsolete by structural transformations that permanently altered how wealth is created, protected, and deployed. The mansion-based wealth model did not fail because of poor execution or changing tastes. It failed because the underlying conditions that made it rational ceased to exist, and no contemporary equivalent has emerged to replace them. The most fundamental change lies in the nature of capital itself. In the late 19th century, wealth was closely tied to physical infrastructure, land control, and long-duration assets that required centralized management. Today, capital is increasingly abstract, mobile, and scalable without physical expansion. Financial instruments, intellectual property, and digital platforms allow wealth to grow without proportional increases in fixed costs. The advantage once offered by land as a stabilizing asset has been eclipsed by instruments that combine liquidity with risk diversification. In this environment, concentrating vast resources into a single physical estate represents not security, but exposure. Taxation and regulation further reinforce this shift. Modern fiscal systems are designed to identify, value, and tax large, illiquid assets with precision. Ongoing property taxes, compliance costs, and transfer taxes impose continuous friction on large estates, regardless of whether they generate income. Unlike earlier periods, when taxation was episodic or avoidable, contemporary frameworks treat visibility as liability. The very permanence that once protected wealth now ensures it remains within regulatory reach. Labor dynamics also prevent a return to the old model. The paternalistic, semi-closed labor systems that once supported large estates are incompatible with modern employment standards and expectations. Skilled labor commands higher wages, greater mobility, and legal protections that eliminate the cost advantages of scale. Internalizing labor no longer reduces volatility. It increases fixed obligations. As a result, operating a large private estate today resembles running a heavily regulated enterprise without the compensating upside of market dominance. Perhaps most importantly, the social function of wealth has changed. Prestige no longer derives primarily from permanence or exclusivity tied to land. It flows from innovation, visibility in global markets, and alignment with contemporary values. Large private estates, rather than signaling stability, often attract scrutiny and criticism. This reversal erodes the reputational benefits that once justified ongoing expenditure without direct return. Wealth today seeks discretion and flexibility, not monumentality. Attempts to revive the mansion-based model typically rely on institutionalization. From the outset, estates are planned as resorts, cultural sites, or branded experiences, with revenue models dependent on constant public engagement. While these structures can be viable, they operate under fundamentally different assumptions. They are businesses first, residences second, and they survive by adapting continuously to market demand. The original model, by contrast, assumed continuity without adaptation, stability without exposure, and control without negotiation. The comparison between old money and new money logic underscores this divergence. Historic fortunes sought to anchor themselves in place, translating financial dominance into territorial presence. Modern fortunes prioritize optionality, maintaining the ability to exit, reallocate, and reinvent. In such a framework, a single, massive estate is not a cornerstone but a constraint. It limits strategic freedom and magnifies downside risk without offering commensurate returns. What remains of estates like Biltmore is therefore not a blueprint, but a case study. They illustrate a moment when private individuals could plausibly design self-contained economic systems that rivaled institutions in scale and scope. That moment has passed, not because ambition has diminished, but because the mechanisms of wealth have evolved. The mansion endures as an artifact of a specific financial order, one that cannot be recreated without dismantling the very systems that define modern capitalism. Understanding why this model cannot return prepares us for the final lesson, which lies not in nostalgia, but in recognizing how wealth adapts or fails when its structures outlive their economic purpose. If you want to draw that lesson together and see what it means for wealth today, let me know and I'll continue. When we step back and view Biltmore Estate not as a marvel of architecture or a curiosity of elite taste, but as an economic artifact, its true significance comes into focus. The mansion was never simply a place to live. It was a financial hypothesis built in stone and land about how wealth could be stabilized, protected, and extended across time. For a brief historical window, that hypothesis appeared correct. Then the conditions changed, and the structure it supported was left standing long after its logic had expired. The core lesson of Biltmore is that extreme wealth is never static. It must constantly choose a form, and each form carries its own risks. In the late 19th century, translating capital into land and large-scale private systems made sense because money itself was unstable, markets were fragmented, and political oversight was limited. Physical scale offered insulation. Control over land and labor offered predictability. Visibility offered legitimacy. Biltmore embodied all three, and for a time, they worked together. What ultimately undermined the model was not extravagance, but rigidity. The estate was designed to endure without fundamental change, yet the economy around it evolved rapidly. Taxation formalized, labor became mobile and regulated. Capital markets deepened, and social attitudes toward wealth shifted. Each change alone was manageable. Together, they altered the environment so completely that the estate's original function became economically irrational. The mansion could still exist, but it could no longer perform the role it had been built to play. This is where the distinction between wealth preservation and wealth performance becomes critical. Biltmore preserved value extraordinarily well. The land retained worth, the structure survived, and the estate avoided outright collapse. But preservation is not the same as sustainability. A system that requires continuous subsidy, adaptation, or reframing to justify itself has already crossed the line from engine to obligation. When wealth must work to sustain the asset rather than the asset sustaining wealth, the model has inverted. Modern capitalism has internalized this lesson. Today's largest fortunes are rarely anchored to single, monumental assets. They are distributed, liquid, and modular. They accept volatility in exchange for adaptability. Where Biltmore sought permanence, modern wealth seeks optionality. Where it internalized costs, modern systems externalize them. Where it relied on continuity, modern capital plans for disruption. The disappearance of mansion-based wealth structures is not an accident of taste. It is a rational response to a different economic landscape. Yet Biltmore still matters, precisely because it shows what happens when wealth outgrows the systems designed to hold it. It reminds us that every era believes its financial logic is durable, and every era eventually discovers its limits. The mansion stands today not as a warning against ambition, but as evidence that even the most carefully constructed systems are contingent. They depend on laws, labor, markets, and social contracts that no private individual controls indefinitely. The enduring value of Biltmore, then, is educational rather than financial. It teaches that scale is only an advantage when the environment rewards it, that control becomes costly when flexibility is required, and that wealth, no matter how vast, cannot exempt itself from structural change. In modern terms, the estate survives because it abandoned the pretense of being a private economic system and accepted a new role as a managed institution. Survival came not from doubling down on the original model, but from letting it go. This is the quiet truth behind America's largest mansion. Its rise was rational. Its operation was disciplined. Its decline was structural. And its endurance required transformation. If you want to keep exploring how wealth builds, breaks, and reinvents itself across history, subscribe to the channel and continue this long-term conversation with me.